The doctor told my wife I was having a heart attack and might not survive the night. I expected her to run to the hospital. Instead, she looked at the clock and said, "We have Sedona in 40 minutes. She boarded the plane while I was fighting for my life, but she had no idea that before she returned, I would make one decision that would change everything she thought she owned. My name is Richard Hayes, I am 72 years old, and that afternoon, I was standing inside my delivery depot when a crushing pain suddenly hit my chest. I dropped the clipboard from my right hand, grabbed the edge of my desk and tried to breathe, but my knees became weak and I slowly fell to the floor. One of my employees immediately called an ambulance while another picked up my phone and called my wife. At the hospital, doctors rushed me into an emergency room and told the nurse to contact my wife immediately. I was still conscious, so I kept staring at the doorway, expecting her to walk through it. Instead, the nurse came back with a look on her face that I will never forget. She told me my wife had said she was already at the airport and had a flight to Sedona in 40 minutes. I asked if she was coming after the flight. The nurse hesitated and said, "She said she cannot cancel the trip." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. At that moment, something inside me changed. I survived the heart attack, but I stopped looking at my marriage the same way. While I lay in that hospital bed, I asked my attorney to bring me every document connected to our properties, business, investments, and bank accounts. There was one account my wife knew nothing about, and I had never planned to tell her about it unless something serious happened. Now something serious had happened. Before I tell you what was inside that account, and what I decided to do while my wife was enjoying her Sedona retreat, subscribe to Dad Emotion Stories and stay with me until the end. Because when my wife finally came home, she discovered that the man she had left in a hospital bed had already changed her entire future. The next morning, I woke up to the soft sound of the hospital monitor beside my bed. I slowly opened my eyes, moved my right hand across the blanket, and felt the wires attached to my chest. My heart was still weak, but I was alive. I looked toward the chair beside my bed. It was empty. My wife had not come back. I reached for my phone on the table, unlocked it, and saw several photographs she had posted from Sedona. She was smiling with her friends beside a red rock canyon. Under the picture she had written, "Finally getting the break I deserve." I stared at those words for several seconds, then placed the phone face down. A few minutes later, my attorney walked into the room carrying a black folder. I motioned for him to sit beside the bed. "Did you bring everything?" I asked. He nodded and placed the folder on my lap. I opened it slowly with my left hand. Inside were documents for properties, investments, business shares, and several accounts I had created years earlier. My attorney explained that most of our major assets were technically held jointly with my wife, but one private investment account was different. I had created it long before our marriage and had continued funding it from profits that came from a business I had built before we met. The account had grown quietly over the years. I asked him for the current balance. He looked at me and said, "Richard, it is worth a little over $8 million. I stared at him. Even after hearing the number, I felt no excitement. I only thought about my wife, sitting somewhere in Sedona while I was fighting to recover from a heart attack. Then my attorney placed another document in front of me. It showed that my wife had recently requested information about several of our joint accounts. She had also contacted a real estate agent about selling one of our properties. I looked up at him. "When did she do this?" He told me the request had been made only 2 weeks earlier. I slowly closed the folder. Suddenly, her trip did not feel like a simple vacation. It felt like part of something bigger. My attorney leaned closer and said, "There is one more thing you need to see." He pulled out a copy of an email my wife had sent before leaving for Sedona. I read the first line and felt my chest tighten again. She had already started planning what she would do with our money if I did not survive. I looked at the email again and asked my attorney to read it with me. The message had been sent by my wife to a real estate agent 2 days before my heart attack. She had written that if something happened to me during my business trip, she wanted to be ready to reorganize everything. Quickly, I felt a cold pressure in my chest, but this time it was not from the heart attack. I placed the email on the hospital blanket and asked, what exactly was she planning? My attorney opened another file and showed me several messages between her and the agent. She had been asking how quickly our vacation home could be sold and how much money she could receive from the sale. I slowly turned my face toward the window. I had spent years believing my wife stayed with me because she loved me. Now I was beginning to wonder whether she had stayed because of what I had built. My attorney then reminded me that the $8 million private account was completely separate from those assets. My wife could not access it without my authorization. I looked at him and said, "Then I want to make sure she never gets it." He nodded and told me we could create a new estate plan immediately. I asked him to prepare everything before my wife returned from Sedona. But there was another problem. Some of our joint properties were already being prepared for sale. I asked him who had authorized the real estate agent. He showed me the paperwork. My wife had signed it. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the blanket. She had been preparing to sell our assets while I was still alive, and now she was away enjoying her retreat as if nothing had happened. My attorney suggested that I wait until I was discharged before making any major decisions. I shook my head. "No, I've waited long. Enough." I asked him to begin transferring my separate assets into a protected trust. Then I asked him to investigate every property and account connected to my wife. Before leaving, he placed one final document on my bed. It was a reservation confirmation for the Sedona resort. The reservation had been paid for weeks in advance. I stared at the date. It had been booked before my wife knew I was having a heart attack. I slowly looked up at my attorney. Then this was not a trip she decided to take after I got sick. He nodded. "Richard, she planned this long before your heart attack." I closed my eyes. And for the first time, I wondered if my heart attack had been the only thing my wife had been waiting for. I could not stop thinking about that reservation confirmation. I slowly turned the paper over in my hands, then placed it on the hospital table and looked at my attorney. "Find out who paid for it," I said. He nodded and made a call. While he was speaking quietly near the window, I reached for my water with my right hand and took a small sip. My heart was still weak, but my mind was suddenly clearer than it had been in years. A few minutes later, my attorney returned and told me the reservation had been paid from a credit card connected to one of our joint accounts, but the payment had been made almost 3 weeks before my heart attack. I stared at him. "She knew this trip was coming that far ahead?" He nodded. Then he showed me another transaction. A large payment had been made to a private consultant who specialized in handling estates and asset transfers. The payment came from the same account. I slowly placed the paper down. My wife had not simply planned a vacation. She had been preparing for a future without me. I asked my attorney to find out what the consultant had been hired to do. He promised to investigate immediately. That afternoon, a nurse came into my room and told me I would probably be discharged the following morning if my condition remained stable. I nodded, but I was not thinking about going home. I was thinking about what I would find when I got there. My wife still believed I was lying helpless in a hospital bed while she enjoyed Sedona. She had no idea that I was quietly rebuilding my entire financial life. That evening, my attorney called again. His voice sounded different this time. "Richard, I found the consultant." I sat upright in the hospital bed. He told me the consultant had been hired to prepare documents that would allow my wife to take control of several assets if I became medically incapable of managing them. I asked who had signed the authorization. He paused. "Your wife." I closed my eyes. Then he added something even worse. The consultant had also contacted a doctor about evaluating me for possible cognitive decline. I slowly opened my eyes. "She was planning to make me look incapable?" I asked. "That is what the documents suggest." I felt anger rise inside me, but I kept my voice calm. I told my attorney to collect everything, every payment, every email, every document, every phone call that could be legally obtained. I wanted the truth before I confronted her. The next morning, as I prepared to leave the hospital, my attorney arrived with one final piece of information. He placed his phone on the table and showed me a photograph. It was my wife at the Sedona resort, smiling beside a man I had never seen before. My attorney looked at me and said, "Richard, I think you need to know who she is spending your money with." I stared at the photograph my attorney had shown me. My wife was sitting beside a man I did not recognize, both of them smiling at a table outside the Sedona resort. I took the phone from my attorney with my left hand and looked closer. "Who is he?" I asked. My attorney told me his name was Daniel Carter. He was a financial consultant who had recently started working with my wife. I felt my stomach tighten. The same man she had hired to prepare documents for my possible incapacity was now sitting beside her on a luxury retreat. I asked my attorney to investigate Daniel immediately. He nodded and told me that Daniel was not just a consultant. He had previously worked for a company that helped wealthy clients move assets into private accounts. I looked at the photograph again and noticed something in the background. On the table beside my wife was a folder with the logo of the same company. I handed the phone back. "Find out exactly what she is doing with him." My attorney promised he would. Later that morning, I was discharged from the hospital. I slowly put on my shirt, buttoned it with shaking fingers, picked up my small suitcase and walked toward the exit. My right hand rested against the wall for support as I took my first careful step. Outside, my attorney was waiting beside his car. I placed my suitcase in the trunk and sat in the passenger seat. As we drove home, I kept thinking about the woman who was supposed to be my wife. When we reached the house, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything looked normal. Her shoes were still beside the stairs. Her coat was hanging in the hallway. I walked into the kitchen and noticed an envelope lying on the counter. It had my name on it. I opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of a document transferring control of one of our investment portfolios to my wife. The date was the day before my heart attack. I looked at my attorney. "She was preparing this before I got sick." He nodded. Then his phone rang. He listened for several seconds before looking directly at me. "Richard, Daniel Carter is not only working for your wife." I waited. "He is also the man she has been seeing privately for months." I felt my fingers go cold. My wife had not simply chosen Sedona over my heart attack. She had been building another life while I was still living beside her. I looked at the document in my hand, then toward the empty hallway. She thought I was still the helpless husband waiting for her to come home. She had no idea I was already preparing to leave her with nothing. I looked at my attorney and asked, "Are you sure Daniel is the man she has been seeing?" He nodded and showed me more pictures and messages. My hand started shaking as I looked through them. There were pictures of my wife and Daniel having dinner together, sitting in his car and meeting at different hotels. This had been going on for months. I put the phone down and sat quietly for a moment. I was not angry because she had another man. I was hurt because while I was working to build a life for both of us, she had been planning a new life behind my back. Then my attorney showed me something else. Daniel had been helping her move money from our joint accounts into a private account. I looked at the amount and could hardly believe it. She had already moved more than $300,000, I asked. "Can she take that money?" My attorney shook his head. "Not if we act now," I told him to freeze every account that I had a legal right to protect. Then I walked into my study, opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and took out an old black folder. Inside were papers from the company I had started before I married my wife. I had never told her the full value of my shares. She knew I owned part of the company, but she had no idea how much it had grown. I placed the papers on the desk and looked at my attorney. "If she wants to leave me with nothing, then she should know something first." He asked what I meant. I pointed at the papers. "She has been planning for my death. I have been planning for my future." My attorney smiled slightly and told me that we could protect my private money and make sure she could not touch it. Then my phone rang. It was my wife. I looked at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Richard?" she said in a sweet voice. "I heard you are home. How are you feeling?" I looked at the document spread across my desk and calmly said, "I am feeling much better. She told me she would be home from Sedona in 2 days." Then she said, "I cannot wait to take care of you." I almost laughed. She had no idea what I had just learned. I told her I would see her when she came home. After I ended the call, my attorney looked at me and asked, "What are you going to do when she gets here?" I looked toward the front door and said, "Nothing yet. Let her come home believing everything is still the same." The next 2 days felt very strange. My wife kept calling me from Sedona, asking how I was feeling and telling me how much she missed me. I answered every call the same way. I told her I was getting better and that I was happy she was enjoying her trip. I never asked about Daniel. I never asked about the money. I never told her that I knew what she had been doing. I wanted her to come home and see everything with her own eyes. During those 2 days, my attorney and I went through every account and every property we owned. We found more transfers I had never known about. My wife had been slowly moving money for months, and some of it had gone to Daniel. We also found emails where she talked about selling our house. After my health became worse, one email made me stop reading. She had written, "Once Richard is gone, everything will be easy." I read that sentence again and again. I saved a copy and closed the laptop. That evening, my attorney told me that the deep private account with more than $8 million was now fully protected. My wife could not touch it. I also moved my company shares into a trust that she had no control over. Then I made one more change. I removed her from the list of people who would receive my private property if I died. I did not do it because I wanted her to suffer. I did it because I no longer trusted her with my future. The next morning, my wife called again. She sounded excited. "Richard, I will be home tomorrow afternoon," she said. "I have something special planned for us." I smiled even, though she could not see me. "I will be waiting." After the call, I walked into the garage and looked at my car. I opened the trunk and placed a small suitcase inside. My attorney had arranged for me to stay at a quiet house outside town for a few weeks while everything was sorted out. I was not running away. I was giving myself time to think. Before leaving the garage, I looked back at my house. I had lived there for more than 20 years. My wife thought she was coming home to the same husband who would forgive her and forget everything. She was wrong. The next afternoon, her car finally turned into the driveway. I stood behind the living room curtain and watched her step out with a smile on her face. She pulled her suitcase from the trunk, walked toward the front door, and stopped when she noticed something missing. Her name was no longer on the mailbox. My wife stood in front of the mailbox for a few seconds, staring at it. Then she looked toward the house. I could see the smile disappear from her face. She walked up the steps, put her hand on the door, and opened it with her key. I stayed in the living room and watched her walk inside. "Richard?" she called. "I am home." I did not answer right away. She walked into the living room and stopped when she saw me sitting in my chair. "Why is my name not on the mailbox?" she asked. I looked at her calmly. "Because things have changed." She laughed nervously. "What are you talking about?" I picked up a folder from the table and placed it beside me. "Sit down." She looked at the folder, then at me. "Richard, you just had a heart attack. You should be resting." I smiled. "I have been resting. I have also been learning a lot." Her face became serious. I asked her how Sedona was. She said it was wonderful and that she needed the break. I nodded, then I asked, "How was Daniel?" Her face changed for just a second. She quickly looked away. "Daniel? What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and placed one photograph on the table. It showed her sitting beside Daniel at the resort. She stared at it without saying a word. I placed another photograph beside it. Then another. She slowly sat down. "Richard, I can explain." I shook my head. "I am sure you can." She reached for my hand, but I moved it away. Then I showed her the bank records. Her eyes became wide when she saw the money she had moved from our accounts. "You checked my accounts?" she asked. I looked at her. "Our accounts." She started crying and said she had only moved the money because she was scared about my health. I asked her why she had hired a man to prepare papers in case I could not manage my own money. She had no answer. Then I showed her the email where she had written about what would happen if I died. She covered her mouth with her hand. I stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked outside. "You left me in a hospital bed so you could go to Sedona," I said. "But that was not the worst thing you did." I turned around and looked at her. The worst thing was believing I would never find out. My wife sat there without saying a word. I could see the fear on her face, but I did not feel sorry for her. I had spent years giving her chances, and she had spent months planning a life without me. She finally looked up and said, "Richard, I made a terrible mistake." I asked her, "Which part?" She started crying and said she never meant for me to get hurt. I looked at her and said, "But you knew I was having a heart attack, and you still chose to stay in Sedona." She had no answer. I walked to the desk, picked up another folder, and placed it in front of her. "There is something else you need to know." She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were the papers, showing that my private $8 million account had been moved into a protected trust. She looked at me and whispered, "You cannot do that." I calmly told her that the money had always been mine and that she had never owned any part of it. Then I showed her the papers for my company shares. She had always believed those shares would become part of our family money. Now she learned that they were also protected. She started asking what she would have left. I looked at her and said, "That depends on what the court decides." She became angry and accused me of trying to punish her. I shook my head. "You made your choices. I am only making mine." Then she suddenly stood up and said she would take half of everything because she was my wife. I told her she could speak to my attorney about that. Just then the front door opened. My attorney walked into the room carrying a large brown folder. He placed it on the table and looked at my wife. "Mrs. Hayes, we need to talk about the money you moved." Her face went pale. He told her that several transfers had already been reported and that Daniel had agreed to speak with the investigators. She looked at me in shock. "You talked to Daniel?" I nodded. "He came to me first." She stood there frozen. Then my attorney placed one final paper on the table. It was a copy of the message she had sent Daniel while I was in the hospital. It said, "If Richard does not make it, everything will finally be ours." My wife stared at the message and slowly sat back down. For the first time, she realized this was no longer something she could explain away as a mistake. My wife stared at the message on the table. She picked it up with both hands and read it again, hoping she had somehow misunderstood it. Then she looked at me. "Richard, I did not mean that." I shook my head. "You wrote it." She started crying and said she was scared because my heart attack made her think about the future. I told her being scared did not explain why she had planned to take my money, sell our property, and make me look too sick to manage my own life. My attorney opened the brown folder and placed several more papers in front of her. He showed her the bank records, the emails, and the papers Daniel had signed. Then he told her that investigators were already looking into the money she had moved. She asked if she was going to lose everything. My attorney answered, "That will depend on what the investigation finds." She looked at me and begged me not to let that happen. I stayed quiet for a moment. Then I told her something I had never said before. "I did not leave you with nothing because I wanted revenge. I protected what was mine, because you showed me that you could not be trusted with it." She asked where she would live if we separated. I told her she could stay in the house until the lawyers finished sorting everything out, but she would no longer have access to my private money or business. She suddenly became angry. "You are my husband," she shouted. I looked at her and said, "And when I needed my wife, you chose a vacation." The room became silent. Then my phone rang. It was Daniel. I answered and put the call on speaker. He told me he had something important to give my attorney. My wife immediately stood up. "What did he tell you?" she asked. I did not answer. Daniel said he had found a copy of a document that proved my wife had planned everything months before my heart attack. He said he would bring it to my attorney the next morning. My wife looked terrified. After I ended the call, she asked me what was on that document. I looked at her and said, "Tomorrow, you are going to find out just how much I already know." The next morning, Daniel came to my attorney's office with a small brown envelope in his hand. I was already there, sitting across from my attorney. Daniel looked nervous as he placed the envelope on the desk. "I should have given you this sooner," he said. My attorney opened it carefully and pulled out several printed emails. I read the first one and immediately recognized my wife's name. She had written to Daniel almost 3 months before my heart attack. She was asking him how much money she could move without making me suspicious. I looked at Daniel. "Why did you keep these?" He lowered his eyes and said, "Because I started getting scared. She kept asking me to help her move money, and I realized she was planning something much bigger." My attorney read through the papers and found another message. This one was even worse. My wife had written that she wanted me to believe she was still a loving wife while she quietly moved our money. Then she wrote, "Once Richard is gone, Daniel and I can start over." I slowly put the paper down. Daniel looked at me and said, "I know I was wrong. I should have stopped her." I told him that he had made his own choices, but telling the truth now was the right thing to do. My attorney copied every page and added them to the case file. Then he told me the evidence was strong enough to show that this had been planned long before my heart attack. Later that afternoon, I returned home. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked inside. She looked tired and nervous. "Did you get something from Daniel?" she asked. I put my keys on the counter and looked at her. "Yes," she lowered her eyes. I placed one printed email in front of her. She read it and started crying. "Richard, please." I shook my head. "I gave you years of my life. When I was lying in that hospital bed, you were planning what would happen to my money if I died." She stood up and tried to reach for my hand. I stepped back. Then I told her that the divorce papers would be delivered the next morning. Her face went completely pale. She whispered, "You are really leaving me?" I looked at her for a few seconds and said, "You left me first. You just did not realize it when you walked onto that plane to Sedona." The next morning, the divorce papers arrived at the house. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table when the lawyer handed them to her. She looked at the envelope for a few seconds before opening it. As she read the first page, her hands started shaking. "Richard, please do not do this," she said. I stood across the room and stayed quiet. She told me she was sorry and that she wanted another chance. I told her I'd given her many chances, including the day I was lying in the hospital hoping she would walk through the door. She had chosen Sedona instead. Now I was choosing myself. My attorney then explained that the divorce would also deal with the money she had moved from our accounts. She could not simply keep it. My wife asked how much she would have left. He told her that the court would decide what she was legally allowed to receive, but my private account and company shares were protected because they had been mine before our marriage. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "So you really are leaving me with nothing?" I shook my head. "I am not leaving you with nothing. I am leaving you with what you are legally entitled to. You are the one who thought you could take everything." She looked down at the papers. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the message she had sent Daniel while I was fighting for my life. My attorney left the room and I walked toward the front door. Before I stepped outside, my wife called my name. I turned around. She asked, "Did you ever love me?" I looked at her for a long moment. "I did. That is why this hurts so much." Then I walked outside. A few days later, the investigation into the money transfers moved forward. Daniel gave the investigators everything he had. The bank records showed that my wife had moved more money than we first knew. Some of it had gone to Daniel, and some had gone to the consultant who was helping her take control of my assets. The court ordered the money to be returned while the case was being reviewed. My wife had spent months planning how to take care of herself after I was gone. She never imagined I would survive, discover the truth, and protect everything before she could touch it. But I was not finished. There was one final thing I wanted to do with the money she had tried to steal. I took the money that my wife had tried to move and decided not to keep it for myself. My attorney told me that once the court finished checking everything, the money that belonged to me would be returned. I already knew what I wanted to do with it. I wanted to build something that would help people who had been left alone during the hardest time of their lives. I remembered lying in that hospital bed, looking at the empty chair beside me, and wondering how many older people had gone through the same kind of pain. So I decided to use part of my money to open a small support center for older people who needed help after a serious illness. I wanted it to be a place where no one had to feel forgotten. While I worked on that plan, my divorce moved forward. My wife tried to fight me at first, but the bank records and emails made it hard for her to explain what she had done. The money she had moved was returned, and Daniel agreed to pay back what he had taken as part of the legal case. A few weeks later, my attorney called me with the final update. The court had protected my private account, my company shares, and the house I had bought before our marriage. My wife would receive only what she was legally owed from the assets we had built together. She could not touch the money I had protected. When I heard that, I did not feel happy about her losing money. I felt relieved that I could finally live without fear of someone taking away everything I had worked for. One evening, I stood outside my house and watched the sunset. The same house that had once felt full of love now felt quiet, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet. My phone rang. It was my wife. I almost ignored it, but I answered. She said she wanted to see me one last time. I agreed to meet her at a small coffee shop the next morning. When I arrived, she was already sitting by the window. She looked tired and much older than I remembered. She apologized again and said she had made the biggest mistake of her life. I listened without interrupting. Then she asked me if I could ever forgive her. I told her, I can forgive you, but I will never trust you with my life again. She started crying. I stood up, left the money she was legally entitled to on the table, threw my attorney's instructions, and walked away. I did not need to destroy her. Her own choices had already done that. But I still had one final lesson to learn. Surviving my heart attack had given me another chance at life, and I was not going to waste it. A few months later, my life looked completely different. The divorce was finished. The money my wife had tried to move had been returned, and the house was finally peaceful again. My wife had lost the life she thought she could build with Daniel, but I had gained something I had not felt in years: peace. I kept my private account, my company shares, and the property I had owned before our marriage. I also kept the promise I had made to myself in that hospital bed. I used part of my money to open the support center for older people who needed help after a serious illness. On the opening day, I stood outside the building and watched families walk through the doors. I thought about how different my life could have been if I had died that afternoon. Then I saw my ex-wife standing across the street. She did not come closer. She just stood there watching. For a moment, our eyes met. I did not feel anger anymore. I simply nodded once. She nodded back and walked away. I never gave her the $8 million she thought she would one day control. I never gave her the business she had already planned to sell. And I never gave her another chance to decide what my life was worth. That was my revenge. I did not destroy her. I simply took back control of my own life and used the money she tried to steal to help people who actually needed it. Looking back, the heart attack was the worst day of my life, but it also opened my eyes. I learned that sometimes the person sitting beside you for 20 years can become a stranger when money enters the room. I also learned that surviving is not only about keeping your heart beating. Sometimes surviving means finding the courage to walk away from the people who keep breaking your heart. My wife chose her Sedona retreat over my life. I chose my life over her. And for the first time in many years, I woke up every morning knowing that the life ahead of me belonged completely to me. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Dad Emotion Stories for more emotional stories about family, betrayal, and second chances. And tell me in the comments, if you survived something like this, would you forgive your spouse, or would you walk away for good?